Life has a way of turning out differently than you expect. 2 years ago, I thought I had my days all planned out. Jonathan, my husband, had passed away, and I assumed I'd spend the rest of my time quietly, tending to the garden, reading, maybe attending the occasional family event. I pictured a peaceful, simple existence. But what I didn't account for was how much silence could settle into a house. Life became silent, reverberating with flashes of temper, and the sounds. How much an empty home could start to feel like a weight, heavy in ways I didn't know how to carry. That was when Nathan arrived. Jonathan's nephew, 28 years old, full of restless energy that I couldn't quite place. He'd spent years in the city, always busy, always moving, and now he was here, in the countryside, looking for something. Maybe peace. Maybe clarity. At first he kept to himself, wandering the woods, sitting on the porch with a book. I didn't think much of it. He seemed content. And I was content with my quiet life. But then, over time, we started talking. About everything and nothing. And it was in those small conversations, those simple exchanges, that I began to realize something. Nathan had a way of asking questions that made me feel seen. Really seen. I hadn't expected it. I hadn't even known how much I needed it. But with him there, it was like a door was opened. Just a little at first, but enough for the light to get in. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't just going through the motions. He was different, grounded, present. And I found myself looking forward to those talks, to his quiet presence. It made the house feel lighter. There was something comforting in it, something that made me feel like I wasn't alone in the world anymore. Nathan worked quietly in the garden, helped with odd jobs around the house. It wasn't about the tasks themselves, but about the space we created in between. There were moments of silence, of shared understanding, of no need for words. And in those moments, I found myself feeling something shift, something I hadn't expected to feel. Maybe it's not too late, I started to think. Maybe life still has more to offer than just the days that have already passed. But when she spoke, it was with hesitancy, as though scared to tell me the truth. Maybe I wasn't done yet. As the days passed, Nathan and I settled into a rhythm. It wasn't anything extraordinary, just quiet, shared moments. We'd spend afternoons working in the garden, or I'd be inside tending to some small project while he wandered the woods, collecting firewood or simply exploring. I had grown accustomed to the stillness of my days, but with him around it felt different. Lighter. He had a way of making everything feel less heavy, of making the silence not so suffocating. One afternoon I was struggling with an old fence in the garden. The wood had rotted in spots, and I needed to replace a few boards. It was a job I had been putting off for years. But something about that afternoon made me want to tackle it. Nathan appeared on the porch, his shirt damp from the heat, looking like he'd just returned from one of his long walks. "Need a hand?" he asked, his voice casual, but there was a softness in it, as if he understood exactly what I was trying to do. I hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Sure, if you don't mind." He didn't waste any time. He rolled up his sleeves and got to work beside me. His movements were steady, deliberate, and I couldn't help but notice how different he was from Jonathan. Jonathan, when he was still here, would have been distracted. His mind would have wandered to something else, and the work would have felt like an obligation. But Nathan was present. There was no rush, no need to hurry. He seemed content to just be there, working alongside me. As we worked, I noticed something else. His questions. They were simple at first. About the flowers I had planted, or the types of trees that lined the edge of the property. But as the days wore on, they grew more personal, more meaningful. He asked about my life before Jonathan, about my dreams, about what I wanted for the future. At first, I was taken aback. No one had asked me those questions in years. He said he'd never introduced me to strangers before. At first I was taken aback. No one had asked me those questions in years. I hadn't even asked myself. It was strange, talking about my past, my hopes, even the things I'd kept locked away. But with Nathan I didn't feel judged. There was no pressure, no expectation, just a quiet, gentle curiosity. And slowly, I found myself opening up. For the first time in a long time, I began to feel like I was reconnecting with parts of myself that had long been forgotten. Thankfully, I didn't feel irritated like it had before. It was strange. I felt reconnecting with parts of myself that had long been forgotten. A few days later, Nathan and I decided to tackle the attic. It had been on my to-do list for years. A forgotten place, filled with dust and memories I wasn't sure I was ready to confront. But something in me shifted, and on that afternoon, I tied my hair back and went up with a box of old photographs I had been meaning to sort through. Nathan, as usual, appeared right when I needed him, his shirt clinging to his skin from the heat of the afternoon. "Need a hand?" he asked, standing in the doorway with that same quiet smile that had started to become so familiar. I hesitated, unsure of whether I was ready to dive into the past, but something in his presence made it easier. "Sure," I said, brushing off the hesitation. "I could use the company." He walked in, effortlessly lifting a heavy trunk like it was nothing. "Careful with that," I said, eyeing the old wood. "That's probably older than both of us combined." Nathan chuckled, setting it down gently. "Then I guess it's a good thing I'm here to help," he said, his voice light. But there was a softness in his eyes that made my heart beat a little faster. We worked together, shifting through boxes of things I had forgotten about. The small mementos from a life I once knew. From a time when I wasn't just a widow passing through the motions. Nathan picked up an old photograph, his fingers brushing the edges carefully, like he understood the weight of what it was. "Is this you?" he asked, holding up a picture of me in my 20s, standing at the edge of a cliff, laughing as the wind tangled in my hair. I looked at the picture, surprised by how much I had changed. "That was a long time ago," I said, brushing it off. He studied the picture for a moment, his green eyes thoughtful. "You were beautiful," he said softly, the words almost making me blush. I laughed nervously, feeling the weight of the moment settle between us. "That was a lifetime ago," I said again, trying to distract myself from the way his words made something stir deep inside me. But Nathan didn't look away. His gaze lingered on the photo, then met mine. "It doesn't matter," he said gently, and the air in the room felt different. It felt charged, as if everything had shifted in that single moment. I swallowed, unsure of what to say. I hadn't expected him to look at me like that. I hadn't expected him to see me in a way I wasn't sure I even saw myself anymore. The silence between us deepened, heavy with something unspoken. I looked away, focusing on the boxes of old things in front of me, trying to ignore the fluttering feeling in my chest. The strange violence became unbearable. I couldn't bear the feeling in my chest. "Wheels, old things," I said, trying to break the tension. "They're just reminders of a life that feels so far away now." Nathan's expression softened as he placed the photo back in the box, his hand brushing mine as he reached for another. "Maybe it doesn't have to feel so far away," he said, his voice low. His words hit me like a wave, overwhelming and unexpected. I froze, unsure of how to respond. But his hand was still so close to mine. His presence felt so tangible, so real, that for a moment, I forgot where I was. All I could focus on was the way he was looking at me, with a kindness I hadn't felt in so long. My heart began to race, and I could feel the weight of my past pressing against me. Everything I had buried, everything I had tried to forget. "I don't know if I can do this," I finally said, my voice quieter than I intended. "You don't have to do it alone, Eleanor," Nathan said gently, his hand brushing mine again. "Life doesn't end just because someone you loved is gone." The words hung in the air, and for the first time in a long time I felt like I could breathe. His words, though simple, were a lifeline I didn't know I was reaching for. I looked up at him, my chest tightening with emotion. There was something about the way he said them, something earnest and unguarded, that made me believe them. For a moment I allowed myself to believe them. We worked in silence for the rest of the afternoon. There were no more words between us, but the air had shifted. The space between us wasn't filled with the same weight of unspoken things. It felt lighter. as if the room itself had exhaled. That evening, Nathan went for one of his long walks, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I sat on the porch, sipping tea as the sun dipped below the horizon. I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. That I didn't have to do this alone. I had spent so many years convincing myself that solitude was the only thing I could rely on, that it was the only thing that would keep me safe. But now, Nathan had shown me something different. When he returned, his cheeks flushed from the evening air, he sat down across from me, his eyes thoughtful. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low, breaking the silence between us. I nodded, even though I wasn't entirely sure. "Just thinking," I said, hesitating. Then, without thinking much about it, I added, "About what you said earlier, about not doing this alone." Nathan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I didn't mean to overstep," he said, his voice gentle. I see how much you've been carrying, and I know what that feels like." He paused, his gaze steady. "You don't have to carry it alone, Eleanor. You don't have to." I sat there in the stillness, the words settling into my chest. For the first time in a long time, I felt the weight on my shoulders begin to lift, even if just a little. The thought of not being alone, of not having to shoulder everything by myself, was a strange and comforting feeling. Maybe it wasn't too late after all. Maybe there was still room for something new. The following days felt different, though it wasn't immediately obvious why. It wasn't as though anything had drastically changed between Nathan and me. We still spent our days the same way. Working in the garden, sitting on the porch, walking through the woods. But there was something new between us. Something unsaid, hanging in the air, making every moment feel heavier, more alive. I could feel it every time he looked at me, and I wondered if he could feel it too. One afternoon, we found ourselves working in the garden again, planting new flowers along the fence. The sun was warm, casting a golden light over everything. The earth felt rich between my fingers, the scent of fresh soil filling the air. It should have been a peaceful moment. But instead, there was a tension in the air, thick and palpable, as if both of us were waiting for something to happen. Nathan, as usual, was quiet, focused on his work, but there was a restlessness in him, a subtle shift that I couldn't ignore. It wasn't until I asked him about his life in the city that the quiet between us broke. "What was it like?" I asked, carefully pulling weeds from the soil. "Living in the city, I mean. You were always so busy, always running around." Nathan paused for a moment, his hands stilling as he looked out at the horizon. His expression was distant, thoughtful. "It was overwhelming," he said slowly, his voice low. "I spent so much time just trying to keep up, trying to stay ahead. I felt like I was always moving, but never really going anywhere. I don't know. I just felt out of place. Like I was supposed to be doing something else, but I didn't know what." I could understand that feeling, more than he might have known. "And that's why you came here?" I asked, glancing at him. "To find something different?" He looked at me then, his green eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made my heart skip a beat. "Yeah," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "I needed to find something real. Something that wasn't all just noise and distractions. I needed to figure out who I am, what I want." I nodded, unsure of what to say next. It wasn't just his words that had caught my attention. It was the way he said them. The way his eyes lingered on mine as if searching for something. For a moment, I felt a strange connection between us. Something that went beyond simple conversation. It was as though we were both searching for the same thing, something we couldn't quite put into words. Without thinking, I reached out and brushed my fingers against his hand, a gentle touch, but one that carried a weight I hadn't expected. He didn't pull away, and for a brief moment the world around us seemed to stop. We were standing there in the middle of the garden, the afternoon sun casting long shadows, our hands almost touching, but not quite. The air between us was charged, like the calm before a storm, and I wasn't sure what would happen next. "I think we all feel like that sometimes," I said softly, breaking the silence, "like we're not where we're supposed to be." Nathan didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked at me, his expression unreadable, "I know what I don't want," he said finally. "I just don't know what I do want yet." I wanted to tell him that I understood. I wanted to tell him that, in some ways, I was still figuring that out too, but the words stuck in my throat. It wasn't just that I wasn't sure how to explain myself. It was that the thought of telling him too much, of letting him see the parts of me I had buried for so long, made me nervous. The truth was, I hadn't allowed myself to think about what I wanted in years. I had spent so long holding on to my grief, to the life I had once had, that I had forgotten how to dream about the future. As if sensing my hesitation, Nathan gave a small smile, one that was both comforting and knowing. "Maybe it's not about figuring everything out right away," he said, his voice gentle. "Maybe it's about just taking it one step at a time. Maybe we don't have to have all the answers now." I nodded, trying to push down the flutter of hope that stirred inside me at his words. It was strange, this feeling, this sense of possibility that had started to take root inside me. I hadn't expected it, hadn't asked for it, but it was there, growing slowly, like the flowers we had just planted along the fence. That evening, after dinner, we sat on the porch, the sky turning a soft pink as the sun set behind the hills. The quiet between us felt different now, less awkward, more comfortable. Nathan leaned back in his chair, his gaze turned toward the horizon, and for a moment, I thought he might say something more, something that would break the stillness between us. But he didn't. Instead, we just sat there, side by side, the world around us slowing down as night began to settle in. I sipped my tea, my mind drifting back to the conversation we had had earlier. What did I want? I had spent so many years focusing on what I had lost, on what I no longer had, that I had forgotten what it meant to dream, to hope. But Nathan's words lingered in my mind. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe there was room for something new after all. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I found myself thinking about Nathan again. His quiet presence, his steady gaze, the way he made me feel like I wasn't alone in the world. I had never expected to feel this way about him, not after everything I had been through. But the truth was, something had shifted between us, something that neither of us could ignore. I didn't know what it meant, or where it was leading, but I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward him. The next few days passed by in a blur of quiet moments, more gardening, more conversations, more shared silences. But there was always this unspoken tension between us, a sense that something was about to change, that we were standing on the edge of something we couldn't quite define. One afternoon, as I was sorting through some old books in the living room, Nathan joined me. He didn't say anything at first, just sat down beside me, his presence a comfort. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, the quiet attention that made everything inside me feel just a little bit lighter. "Do you ever think about starting over?" he asked suddenly, his voice low, almost tentative. I looked at him, surprised by the question. "Starting over," I repeated. "Yes, sir." "Yeah," he said, his fingers brushing the pages of a book. "Leaving the past behind. Finding something new. Someone new." The question hit me harder than I expected. I didn't know how to answer. It felt impossible to even consider, given everything I had been through, but at the same time, there was a part of me that couldn't help but wonder. What if? "I don't know," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've always thought it was too late for that." Nathan's gaze softened, and for the first time, I saw something vulnerable in his eyes. "It's never too late," he said quietly. And in that moment, I believed him. The days grew cooler as autumn settled over the countryside, and with it came a sense of finality, a quiet turning of the page. Nathan and I continued to spend our time in the garden, working side by side, our conversations growing more personal, more real. The small moments between us, exchanges of glances, soft words shared on the porch, seemed to carry a weight. One that I hadn't fully understood until now. One crisp afternoon, as the wind carried the scent of falling leaves through the air, we decided to take a walk through the woods. The trees were ablaze with shades of gold and orange, the ground littered with fallen leaves that crunched beneath our feet. We walked in silence at first, the sound of our steps mingling with the rustling of the trees, the distant call of birds overhead. It was a peaceful walk, the kind where you didn't need to speak, where the companionship of another person felt enough. But even in the quiet, there was something stirring beneath the surface, something both of us were trying to ignore. Finally, we reached a small clearing, and Nathan stopped. His eyes scanned the trees, the way the sun filtered through the branches, casting long shadows on the ground. It was beautiful, in a way that made my chest tighten, as though the world itself had held its breath for this one moment. "I've been thinking," Nathan said, his voice low, his gaze still focused on the trees. I glanced at him, unsure of where this was going. "About what?" I asked, trying to steady my voice, though I could feel the heat of his words gathering around us. He hesitated for a moment before looking at me, his green eyes serious, searching mine. "I don't know where this path leads," he said slowly, as though weighing each word carefully. "But I know I don't want to walk it without you." The world seemed to stop just for a moment. My heart stuttered in my chest and my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just the words he said, but the way he said them, so honest, so open, as though he was offering me something precious. Something I didn't know I needed. I looked at him, unsure of how to respond. I wasn't ready to admit what I was feeling, not yet. I wasn't sure if I even understood it myself. But there was something in his eyes, a vulnerability I hadn't expected to see, and for the first time, I realized that perhaps he felt the same pull I did, that same quiet desire to reach for something new. Something real. "Nathan," I whispered, my voice trembling slightly. "I don't have the answers. I don't even know if I'm ready to find them." He smiled softly, and the warmth in his expression made my heart ache. "We don't have to figure everything out right now," he said, his tone gentle. "We can figure it out together, one step at a time." I looked down at my hands, folding them together in front of me, trying to steady the sudden rush of emotions that threatened to overwhelm me. It felt like everything I had known was shifting, the ground beneath me changing with every word he spoke. The past, the grief, the loneliness. It had all been so heavy, so consuming. But in this moment, with Nathan standing beside me, it didn't feel as though it was all I had left. For the first time in years, I felt as though there was something more. There was a chance to move forward, to let go of the weight of my past and embrace whatever the future might hold. "I think you're right," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "Maybe it's time to stop holding on to everything. To stop thinking it's too late for something new." Nathan reached out, taking my hand in his touch gentle but firm, as though he was anchoring me to the present moment, to the possibility of something different. His fingers intertwined with mine, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the spark of something I had forgotten. It wasn't a promise, not exactly, but it was enough. It was a moment of shared understanding, a silent agreement that neither of us was walking this path alone. We stood there in the clearing, the wind rustling through the trees, our hands still entwined, the silence between us more comforting than it had ever been. The world around us felt vast, infinite even, and yet in that moment it seemed as though everything had fallen into place. Maybe we didn't have all the answers. Maybe we didn't even know where we were heading, but together, it felt like we could face whatever came next. As we turned to leave the clearing, walking side by side, I realized something I hadn't been able to admit before. I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't afraid of the unknown, of the future, or of the changes that had already begun to take root in my life. For the first time in years, I felt hope. Quiet, fragile, but real. And it wasn't just about Nathan, it was about me too. It was about rediscovering parts of myself that I had buried, about opening my heart to the possibility of new beginnings. That evening, as we sat on the porch watching the stars appear in the darkening sky, Nathan turned to me, his expression thoughtful, as if he was still processing everything we had shared. There was a softness in his eyes, a warmth that mirrored the feeling blooming inside me. "You know," he said, his voice gentle, "I think this might be the beginning of something good." I smiled, my heart light. "I think so too." And as the night wrapped around us, the promise of tomorrow felt closer than ever. There were no guarantees, no perfect answers. But in this moment, surrounded by the quiet of the night and the possibility of what was to come, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't walking this path alone. The air was growing colder, and the days were getting shorter. But for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like the world was closing in. The changing seasons no longer seemed to reflect the passage of time in a way that filled me with dread. Instead, they felt like an invitation to breathe, to live again. It wasn't that the past had magically disappeared, or that the loneliness had vanished. It was simply that Nathan had become a quiet presence in my life, one that filled the empty spaces in a way I never expected. Our time together had become a routine, not the kind that grows stale or predictable, but one that anchored me in something real. The silence between us was not awkward. It was comforting. We didn't need to fill every moment with conversation. Sometimes we'd sit in the garden, tending to the flowers, our hands brushing as we passed tools to one another. Sometimes, we'd be in the kitchen, moving around each other in that easy rhythm of shared space. And then there were moments like today. Moments when the air between us felt heavier, thicker, as if it was holding something we hadn't yet dared to speak aloud. Nathan was at the stove, stirring a pot with slow, deliberate motions. I stood at the counter, chopping vegetables, but my mind was elsewhere. The way he moved, the way his presence seemed to fill the room, it was almost as if the weight of the house was shared between us. His quiet energy had a grounding effect, pulling me away from the thoughts that always seemed to linger in the back of my mind. "You're awfully quiet tonight," Nathan said, his voice pulling me out of my thoughts. I hadn't realized how lost I'd become in them. I looked over at him, trying to steady myself, but there was a certain vulnerability in his eyes tonight. A quiet kind of tension that seemed to match the thoughts running through my own head. "Just thinking," I replied softly. He raised an eyebrow, still stirring the soup. "About what?" I hesitated. I wasn't sure I was ready to share the depth of what was on my mind, the things I couldn't quite put into words. How everything in my life had shifted so drastically in such a short time. How despite the grief, despite the years of carrying it, I felt something new with him, something I didn't understand. "You," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. "And the way things have changed. How much has shifted in such a short time. I never expected this." Nathan stopped stirring for a moment, his eyes meeting mine. His gaze softened, and in that moment, I saw something in him that mirrored what I was feeling. It wasn't just a passing thought. It wasn't an idle curiosity. There was something more. Something that went beyond the surface. "You're not the only one," he said quietly, his voice low, almost like a confession. "I never expected it either. I thought I'd come here, get some space, and go back to my life. But it's not like that. Not anymore." My heart fluttered in my chest. I wasn't sure what this was, what we were building, but I knew it was something real. It was something that held weight, something I wasn't sure I was ready to face, but couldn't ignore. We were both caught in this web of emotions, trying to untangle it without knowing where it would lead. He stepped closer, his gaze intense but gentle, as if he was waiting for something, for me to give him a sign. His presence was magnetic, and yet, it was the vulnerability in his eyes that held me still. It wasn't an easy thing to let go of the past, to allow someone in after all these years of solitude. But Nathan had a way of making me feel seen, truly seen, in a way that no one had in a long time. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low, "I think about what you said. The idea that it's never too late. But it's not just about starting over, is it? It's about moving on from everything that holds us back. It's about letting go." The words felt like a weight dropped into the air between us, heavy with meaning, heavy with truth. I felt them sink deep into my chest, settling somewhere I didn't know was still capable of feeling. Could I let go? Could I really let go of the years of grief, of loneliness, of the person I had become in the absence of love? Could I allow myself to step into something new, to open my heart again, after it had been closed off for so long? "I'm afraid," I said before I could stop myself. The word slipped out, raw and unguarded. "Afraid that if I let go, I'll lose myself. I don't know if I can move forward." I don't know if I'm ready for something new, for this. His face softened, and he reached out, his hand brushing mine in a gesture so gentle, it almost made me break. There was no judgment in his touch, no impatience, only a quiet understanding. A deep, unspoken understanding that we were both standing on the edge of something uncertain, something fragile, but that we didn't have to navigate it alone. You don't have to be ready all at once, Nathan whispered, his voice steady. You don't have to figure it all out right now. Just take the next step, whatever that is. Suddenly, I closed my eyes for a moment, letting his words settle over me like a gentle rain. The pressure I had been carrying, the constant need to hold it all together, began to loosen, just a little. I wasn't sure what would happen next. I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to face what was coming, but in that moment, standing in the quiet warmth of our shared space, I knew I didn't have to face it alone. Jayway, we didn't speak for a while after that. The silence between us was no longer heavy, it was comforting. It was the kind of silence that comes after something important has been said, when the weight of words has been lifted and replaced with the understanding that sometimes no more needs to be said. We sat together, our shoulders brushing, hands close but not quite touching, the night settling around us like a blanket. Later, as we finished cleaning up, he smiled at me, softly, gently, with an understanding that seemed to say everything we hadn't yet put into words. And I smiled back, not knowing what the future would hold, but knowing that, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't walking alone. The days following Nathan's quiet confession weighed on me in ways I hadn't expected. I found myself looking at him, studying the way he moved through the house, how the simple act of him sitting at the kitchen table, or walking through the garden, had become a familiar comfort. It was no longer just his presence that I had grown accustomed to, but the feeling of having someone truly see me, without the walls I had built around myself. One evening, as we stood on the porch watching the sunset, I realized just how much had changed. A part of me, the part that had shut itself away in the years after Jonathan's death, had begun to soften. It wasn't that I had forgotten the past. It would always be with me, shaping who I was. But I was learning that it didn't have to define my future. Nathan stood beside me, his quiet presence grounding me. He looked at me then, his green eyes reflecting the fading light of the sunset. "Eleanor," he began, his voice hesitant but earnest. "I know we're both walking through something uncertain right now. But I just want you to know, no matter what happens next, I'm here." The words were simple, yet they carried a depth that resonated deep inside me. He wasn't offering me a promise that everything would be perfect. He wasn't asking for anything from me except for the truth. And the truth was, I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if I was ready to open myself fully, to trust again. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the unknown. I was willing to take the next step, whatever that might be. "I'm here too," I said softly, turning to face him. "And I don't know what comes next, but I know we don't have to figure it all out right now." Nathan smiled, a gentle, reassuring smile that made my heart flutter in a way I hadn't expected. "We'll figure it out together," he said, his voice steady. And in that moment, I realized that this, whatever it was between us, didn't need to have all the answers. The beauty lay in the uncertainty, in the willingness to face it together. The following days were quieter. Nathan's return to the city loomed closer, but it wasn't filled with the same heaviness I had once expected. There was no sense of finality, no painful goodbye. Instead, there was a quiet sense of understanding between us. We were both in the midst of something new, something fragile, but also something real. The night before he left, we sat together on the porch, the evening air cool and crisp. The soft rustling of leaves was the only sound between us as we shared a simple meal, enjoying each other's company, without words. But the weight of the moment hung in the air. Neither of us knew what came next, but there was no longer a need to define it. "Tomorrow, I'll be heading back," Nathan said, breaking the silence with a quiet inevitability. "But I want you to know, this isn't the end." I nodded, My heart heavy but not with sadness. It was the weight of possibility, of something new that had taken root between us. "I know," I whispered, my voice filled with unspoken understanding. "And I don't think this is the end either. Just the beginning of something different. Stay safe. Stay safe." He looked at me, as though trying to read my mind. We sat there for a long while, the night wrapping around us like a blanket, keeping us warm in the shared silence. The next morning, as Nathan packed his things, I watched him from the doorway, a quiet smile on my face. There was no need for grand declarations or promises. We both knew that whatever came next, it would be different. The past no longer held me captive, and the future didn't seem so daunting anymore. Nathan turned to me before he left, his gaze steady and sure. "I'll be back," he said softly, and I could see in his eyes that he meant it, even if we didn't have the words to say exactly what that meant. "I'll be here," I replied, my heart light, and as I watched him drive away, something in me had changed. The road ahead was still uncertain, still full of unknowns, but for the first time in years, I was ready to face it, whatever it might bring. As Eleanor and Nathan step into a new chapter, they remind us that life's most profound moments often begin with uncertainty. If you've ever found yourself at a crossroads, unsure of what comes next, remember, it's never too late to start over. Embrace the unknown, trust the journey, and take that first step toward a future full of possibilities. What new beginnings are waiting for you? Don't be afraid to face them, just as Eleanor and Nathan did together, with an open heart. Your next chapter could be just around the corner. What will you choose today? If you enjoyed this story, don't miss out on the next one. Subscribe now for more stories that connect, inspire, and remind you that it's never too late to start something new.